All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. Start by thanking our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, Max and Brenda Lapkovsky, in honor of Yitzchak Meir's upcoming bar mitzvah. Dr. Riva Mitzner, in commemoration of the first yarzheit of her father, Dr. Larry Schneck, Aryeh Ben Chaim, Zichrono Livracha. Our week of learning sponsors, Mark and Sarah Meisler, for the yarzheit of Mark's grandmother, Ann Altman, Chana Devora Bas Yehuda, Bill and Rezi Eskin, Lezecha Nishmas Bill's father, Mordechai Ben David, and Rezi's mother, Tzivya Bas Moshe Aaron. Our Daf Yomi sponsors, the Plonka family, for the yarzheit of Yitzchak Ben Shlomo, the Aryeh Kadosh, incredible, and Robert and Lisi Lilienfeld, in memory of Robert's grandmother, Dorothy Myers. You hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, and the family's ein chama. And I will say, with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is daf Zayin, and we are picking up V Bais Ema. We left off kind of in the middle of it. No, not in the middle, towards the end. It's a 2, 4, 6, 8 lines up from the bottom. We'll say also, I'll mention, I sent out yesterday on the WhatsApp chat just a PDF with pictures. Again, you don't need them. A lot of the things we're going to do today are a little bit more self-explanatory, but the Maaseh definitely is helpful. Over the course of this year, I'll make reference to the picture numbers that we're looking at if you want to follow along. So the Maaseh, remember again, the Gemara says as follows. We left off yesterday with a machlokus between Rabbanan and Rabbi Shimon about the size of a sukkah. So the Rabbanan were quoted as saying that the sukkah shtaim kil chasan, 2 regular walls, and a third wall that only has to measure a tefach. And Rabbi Shimon held that halacha l'maisa, the minimum shear for a sukkah is 3 walls, with a 4th wall the size of a tefach. So remember again, the Gemara wanted to suggest that their machlokes was based on a much more global machlokes of yesh em la mikra, yesh em la masores. When we go ahead and we darshan a pasuk, do we look at how the pasuk is written, or do we, that's yesh em la masores, or do we look at how the pasuk is read? Yesh em la mikra. And of course, it creates an incredible nafkamina over here by Succah, because the Torah states the word sukkos 3 times. The first 2 times it's written chaser without a vav, 3rd time it's written with a vav. So the shayla just is, how many words do you have to work with for darshaning purposes? Okay, we don't have to go through the whole thing again. So the Gemara says, Ibaisim, another possibility is, the kuli alma, ki asay hilchasad ligareya, v'yesh em lamasoras. But it could very well be that halacha l'maaseh, everyone agrees that the halacha l'Moshe Sinai, actually I think I skipped. Sorry, go one back. V'bais ema, d'chuli alma yesh em lamasoras. I will say in this version again, everyone holds that you assign primacy to the written form of the word. V'hacha b'hacha miflagi. Here, what are they arguing about? Mar savar ki asay hilchasa ligareya, umar savar ki asay hilchasa lahosif. Oh, well, this is very interesting. Maybe the machlokes halacha l'Moshe Sinai is as follows. Everyone agrees that the last wall only has to be a tefach. Perhaps the machlokes in the halacha l'Moshe Sinai is at the end of the day, is the halacha l'Moshe Sinai coming to add a wall or to subtract a wall? One other possibility is the choli alma ki asay hilchasa ligareya. Other possibilities, no, everyone agrees that the halacha Moshe Sinai is coming to go ahead and take away a wall. Furthermore, again, everyone agrees that we assign primacy to the written form of the word. But here's what's interesting. If you remember again, every time we started darshaning, if you remember again, we always took off the first basukos. Right? Why do we take off the first basukos? You remember why? Because that was used to teach us the din of Sukkah. So we operated under the assumption that the word that teaches you the core halacha cannot be used for darshaning purposes. So the Gemara says maybe that's a machlokas. Mar savar darshan tchilos, mar savar in darshan tchilos. One opinion says ultimately we go ahead and we darshan the first word, and the second opinion says we don't darshan the first word. Okay, I will say so again. Obviously, it would be Rabbi Shimon who holds that you darshan the first word, so therefore he has an extra sukkos at his disposal, leaving it with a sukkah of 4 walls, 3 regular walls, 1 of a tefach. Whereas Rabbanon would say we don't darshan tchilos, and therefore again you're left with a sukkah of 3 walls, 2 regular walls, 1 of a tefach. Both say the Gemara goes on. Rav Masna Amar Tamid Reb Shimon Hacha. Rav Masna says no. It has nothing to do with Yesh Ein LaMasoras, Yesh Ein LaMikra. Rabbi Shimon's logic is from somewhere else. Where does he learn it from? Interestingly enough, from the pasuk in Yeshaya. V'sukkah tia l'tzel yoma michorev u'lemachse u'lemistar mizerem u'mimater. The pasuk speaks out the idea that a sukkah is there to do what? To shield you from the elements. And Abba say, in order for a sukkah to shield you from the elements, what must the sukkah have? What must the sukkah have? 4 walls. 4 walls. So an interesting drasha. Granted, it's a pasuk from the Navi, not a pasuk ultimately again from the Torah, but ultimately Rabbi Shimon saying that's how you learn out the shir of sukkah. It's got to be 4 walls. Now, of course, again, remember, everyone will agree effectively that the halacha of Moshe ben Sinai does the same thing, which is tells you that the last wall need not be a complete wall, only needs to be a partial wall. So all you need is a tefach. But Lamaisa, that's Rabbi Shimon's logic. So I will say, ultimately, before we go on, so we know how do we paskin? We paskin like the Chachamim, like the Rabbanon, that the shir of a sukkah is shalosh tefanos, 3 walls, but it's really shtei tefanos umashehu, 2 walls, and the 3rd wall only has to be a tefach. That's ultimately how we paskin. There's a beautiful Sfas. The Ger Rebbe says that what's the symbolism? So interesting that's the shir of a sukkah. 2 walls and a tefach. So listen to what the Sasana says. It says you have to visualize the image, right? So imagine like this, a visual display over here. You have, right, 1 wall, 2 walls, right? So 1, 2, and then the 3rd wall only has to be a tefach like this. Says the Sasana. What's the imagery? An embrace. An embrace, a hug. So the Sas Emes says the sukkah is the embrace of the Ribono Shel Olam. The sukkah which comes after the Yamim Noraim. Sukkah which comes after the din. And again, the overwhelming nature of Rosh Hashanah, Aseret Yimei Tshuva, of Yom Kippur. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, my children, I love you, come out to me. Come out to me, and I embrace you in the sukkah. The sukkah is when we are embraced by the Ribono Shel Olam. That's the shtei defanos umashehu. It's the embrace of the Ribono Shel Olam. It's such a beautiful idea. So the Gemara goes on. So I'll say, so now, the truth is, this discussion is even independent of how you paskin Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanon, but knowing that we paskin like the Rabbanon, that's what we're going to focus on is, where do you put the tefach? Right? So now the 3rd wall only has to be a tefach. Where do you put that tefach? Amrli Rav Kahana, V'Ravasi. Amarav, Ma'amido Kineged Hayotze. So I says it's very simple. You put it jutting out of the other wall. So we'll say, so again, the idea over here is, let's just, on a simple illustration, is that, I'm sorry, this is not included in the PDF I sent you, because the PDF only goes from Zayin or Aleph. But again, it's easy enough to remember, which is, imagine we're always operating with 2 walls like this, right? I have 1 wall like this, 1 wall like this. So the Gemara says, where does the tefach wall come out of? It's attached to one of the other walls. That's it. So the Gemara says, Ma'amido kineged hayotze, Amrli Rav Kahana Rav Asi l'Rav, top of Zayin, v'ya'amidenu kineged rosh tor. Perhaps you should now both say, now we're assuming right now the 2 whole walls are set at a right angle with each other. And so we're assuming that the tefach wall, which is wall number 3, will also be set at a right angle as well. Right? That's the, which makes sense. That's the assumption we're working with. So the Gemara says, why does it have to be set at a right angle? Maybe you should set it at a slant, at an angle. Look at Rashi. So if you look, actually, I think most Gemaras, do you have a picture on Rashi there? Right, so you can see, you have 2 regular walls set at a right angle, and then that 3rd wall, which is the tefach wall, is slanted. Now Rashi says, we don't have to get into this, but Rashi, what will be the logic of that? In other words, why would you set it up like that? So we'll say it's interesting. If you're looking to create the image of an enclosure, having the 3rd tefach wall a bit more slanted creates a bit more of an enclosed space. So in other words, the Gemara is just saying, why go ahead and put it at right angles? maybe take the tefach wall and put it at a slant. Shasik Rav. Rav was silent, he didn't know what the answer to this. Itmar Nami Amar Shlomo Mishmei the Levi, Ma'amido Kineged Hayotze, V'chein Morin Ben Midrasha, Ma'amido Kineged Hayotze. So ultimately, again, Shmuel said in the name of Levi, no, the accepted way to go ahead and set up wall number 3, the tefach wall, is to put it at a right angle with the 2 other walls. Good. So we'll say, so that's how the Gemara is operating right now, that the ideal setup for your minimum share of a sukkah is to have 3 walls, all at right angles to each other, with the 3rd wall only needing to be a tefach, but that tefach being attached to one of the other, we'll call it complete walls. Good. Rav Simon, Ditim Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi Omar. I will say this is very interesting. Osalo tefach shochek uma'amido b'pachos mishlosha tefachim samach l'dofen v'chapachos mishlosha samach l'dofen kilavudam. So also listen to this. Rabbi Simon has an interesting approach to how to go ahead and structure your sukkah. So you have 2 complete walls. Rabbi Simon then says, when it comes to the 4th wall, when it comes to the 3rd wall, here's what you should do. Make the 3rd wall what we call a tefach shochek. I will say now, what's a tefach shochek? Look at Rashi. Tefach shochek literally means a loose tefach. Rashi says, modedin bedalit etzbaos she'enam nogos zubazu tavi tefach u'mashahu. That what you do is, Rabbi said, there are 2 ways that you can go ahead and measure a tefach, right? What are the 2 ways? Either with 4 fingers tightly compressed, or at the end of the day, with 4 fingers a little bit loosely spread apart. So comes along Rav Simon, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, says, make a wall that's made of a tefach, a 1 tefach wall, right? Ultimately, again, but make it a loose tefach. You'll see why in just a moment. So 4 finger breadth loosely, and we'll say, what should you do? Place that plank, we'll call it, less than 3 tefachim of one of the other walls. I will say, if you're following along in the pictures, this is picture number 35 in the PDF I sent you. Again, so you have your 2 complete walls, the tefach shochek, the small plank, and you place that plank within 3 tefachim. Now, both say, if you place the plank within 3 tefachim, what happens? What is that called? Lavud. What does lavud say? We essentially view the entire area as being closed. So we'll say, what do you effectively therefore make out of your 3rd wall? What do you have? You essentially have a little bit less than a 4 tefach wall. Now, what's the beauty of having a 4 tefach wall? Plus, remember again, what is the minimum share for sukkah? 7 by 7, which means that your 3rd wall has the majority of the minimum share for sukkah. Okay, so it's just essentially what Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is saying. Just for the same money, right? For the same little 3rd wall, for the same tefach 3rd wall, you could just end up making something much more halachically substantive. So instead of just having a 3rd wall that's a tefach, you actually could end up having a 3rd wall that's actually halachically 4 tefachim, which is the majority of the minimum shear of a sukkah. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Uma'amida b'pachos migimel samuch la'achas hadafanos. Upachos migimel kalavid v'havi lekemechitza shal dalet tvachim umeshech sukkah shiva nimtza rubo shal dofen asui. So again, do you have pictures in the margin of your Gemara also? Yeah. Good. So you can see this is picture bays. This is picture bays in the margin of your Gemara. It should be in the Mesoras Hashas. Hopefully you have it there. Again, we'll say, or picture 35. Very simple. So we'll say, all this is doing is taking this. Remember, we're adopting the same premise as the Chachamim. The sukkah just has to be 2 complete walls and a 3rd wall that's a tefach. All Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is saying is, you could go ahead and maximize that tefach 3rd wall by first of all making it a little bit bigger, tefach shochek, so that makes it a little bit larger, putting it within 3 tefachim, you end up having a wall of 4 tefachim plus a little majority of the sukkah. I will say an incredible muster. Sometimes in life, it's not what you have, but it's what you do with it. And it's how you utilize it. It's the same tefach wall. But look, before Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi came along, right? 1 tefach wall gave you a wall. How big? 1 tefach. Rabbi Yisrael Levi says in life, it's all about not what you have, but how you use what you have. And if used correctly, a 1 tefach wall can become a 4 tefach wall. And a 4 tefach wall is the majority of the minimum shear of a sukkah. I mean, it's such a muster in life. We often think that the answer to our life challenges is more. If I had more, then I'd be successful. If I had more, then I'd be happier. Well, sometimes we do need more. Sometimes I don't need more. Sometimes I have everything I already need. I just have to figure out how to try to use it. This is true in Gashmias, it's true in Ruchnias, it's true in everything in life. Often, we have everything we need to be successful. We just don't always deploy our resources in the most impactful and effective fashion. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda, Succah suikim mavoi. What happens if you have a sukkah that is made like a mavoi? I both say this is picture 36. So sukkah that's made like a mavoi is very simple. It's 2 parallel walls. So remember again, up until now you've always been assuming that, and by the way, it's also a picture, we have a lot of pictures today, and it's also picture Gimel in your Gemara, right? So you have it right here on the daf. So imagine for a moment, the first 2 walls of your sukkah are parallel walls. It calls it a mavui, because remember again, a mavui is an alleyway that runs between chatzeros. So you have 2 parallel walls. Now obviously I need a 3rd wall to make my sukkah. So how do I put my sukkah? The sukkah so you can mavui, kshera, va'oso tefach ma'amido, l'chol ruach sheyirtzeh. So both say, so ultimately again, if you have 2 walls that are parallel, it's not a problem. In other words, you go ahead and you set up the 3rd wall, wherever you want to set up the 3rd wall, and you are good to go. Now both say, we're going to see for our purposes, such a sukkah like that, you're going to have to do a number of things in order to make it kosher. But Lamaisa, right now we'll just accept Rabbi Yehuda's statement, that Allah Lamaisa, you can have 2 parallel walls, put the 3rd wall wherever you want. The Gemara says, the Chorash Yirtzeh, Simon Luter V'Shoban Levi Omer, O Salo Pas Arba Umashu, Uma'amido B'Pachos Mishlosha Samuch L'Dofen, V'Chol Pachos Mishlosha Samuch L'Dofen, Kilavud Dami. So the Gemara says, no, what do? You have to go ahead and say, in this case, you have to do something a little bit different. You have to go ahead. So remember again, it's now what you follow the flow over here. You have Rav Yehuda saying that if you have a sukkah that's made like a mavoi, 2 parallel walls, no problem, totally fine. Just take your 3rd wall, that's a tefach, put it wherever you want. When I say put it wherever you want, it means attach it to whatever wall, whatever direction you want, and you're good to go. Rabbi Simon and Rabbi Shoban Levi says, no, not so pashit. If you have a sukkah that's made like a mavoi, i.e. 2 parallel walls, the only way to make that into an effective sukkah is how? You have to make another board. You have to take another board. That board has to be arba umashahu. That board now has to be 4 tfachim and a little bit. And what do you do with that board? Place it within 3 tfachim of one of the two parallel walls. And I will say, what does that do? If it's less than 3 tfachim, then what? It's lavud. And when you put it all together, what do you have? 7.5 or 7 and a bit tfachim. I will say that's picture number 37. So comes along Rabbi Shoban Levi in this case and says, I'm sorry, if you have parallel walls, putting a board of a tefach is not going to be enough to make that sukkah kosher. You're going to need a board of 4 tfachim placed within 3 tfachim of one of the walls in order to effectively make a wall of 7 plus a little tfachim. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. The Gemara says, Ma'ishna Hasam, de ka'amrit sagye tefach shochek, u'ma'ishna hacha de ka'amrit baye pas arba. We'll say, why was it that in the previous case, right, it was enough to use a board. In other words, you used the same idea, which was, you took a board that was a tefach, placed it within 3 tefachim of the pre-existing wall, and you made for yourself a nice little wall of 4 tefachim plus a little. Why was that enough over here? And yet here, by the case of the parallel walls, you need a board that's more than 4 tefachim, a little bit more than 4 tefachim, within 3 tefachim of the pre-existing wall. Or why in the first case that I only need a board of a tefach, and here I need a board of 4 tefachim? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you, it's very simple. Hasam, de'ika shtei defanos kil chasan, sagile betefach shochek. Hacha, deleka shtei defanos, I'ika pas arba in Ilo lo. Tutra Rishon Levi says, Rabbi say, it's very simple. Which is in the previous case, you had two proper walls. What do you mean two proper walls? The walls were perpendicular to each other. Right? The walls met at a right angle. They were connected. Rabbi say over here, you're dealing with a situation of two perpendicular walls. How do two perpendicular walls make a sukkah at all? I'm sorry, two parallel walls, thank you. How do two parallel walls make a sukkah at all unless they are connected by something more substantive? So there lies the difference. So we'll say very interesting distinction. If you have two perpendicular walls, two walls at a right angle, then Einachinami, really all you need is that third wall of a tefach. And Rabbi Yishmael said, by the way, you can maximize that third wall by moving it within 3 tefachim of one of the other walls, thereby making a third wall of effectively 4 tefachim. But the same Rabbi Yishmael says, 1 second, if you have two parallel walls, those walls are not connected by anything. They can't become a sukkah unless you go ahead and put a third wall there of some significant substance. So if you go ahead and you make a third wall over there, I will say essentially of what? A plank of 4 tefachim, within 3 tefachim of the pre-existing wall, now you've made a wall, I will say, of essentially what? Of what? 7 tefachim and a little, which is in and of itself the minimum shear of sukkah. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rava, another case. Amar Rava, or actually he's commenting still on the same case. Amar Rava ve'eino niteres ela b'tzuras haPesach. And Rava says, by the way, still focusing, I will say, over here on the case of the sukkah. So, well, actually now we're jumping back for just a bit. In the case of the perpendicular walls, Rava says, in order for the third wall to work, you need a tzuras haPesach. Now we'll say tzuras haPesach, back to our Eruvin days, is a doorway. A doorway, right? Resembling a doorway. 2 side posts and a post that goes down. We'll give Rashi just a moment. Amar Rava ve'eino niteres ela b'tzuras haPesach. Be'eruvin Amar heichi dami tzuras haPesach. Kana mikan, v'kana al gabehen. Right? We'll say what's the tzuras haPesach? 2 boards on each side, a board that goes across the top. V'achakam Rava. The tefach sheshaninu bebraisa shematir bedofen shlishis. I'm just reading Rashi. Eino matir ela imkein aso lios tefach tzuras haPesach halpnei kol hadofen kulo. Ketzad. So we'll say, listen to this. Let me tell you the rest of this outside. Rava says, when we say that the third wall only has to be a tefach, I will say, listen to how Rava interprets this. Rava says that means, well, essentially, take a board that is 1 tefach, you split it in half. You go ahead and you use it to make 2 side posts, make something across the top, and if you make that third wall a tzuras haPesach, that is how you are machshir the sukkah. We'll say it's picture number 38. Picture 38. So remember again, this is the original sukkah, the perpendicular sides. So therefore you want to go ahead and you want to make the third side. Right? You want to put up the third wall. The third wall needs to be a tzuras haPesach. Just the chiddush is, the side posts themselves only have to measure half a tefach each. So you can have a very, very, very thin tzuras haPesach. We'll say that's Rava Shita. Igidami, an alternate version of Rava. Amar Rava v'niteres nami b'tzuras haPesach. We'll say an alternate version of Rava is that you could also use the tzuras haPesach, which means Rava will say like this: not only can you go ahead and use a tefach board for the third wall, and if you use a tefach board, how do you use it? Just take a tefach board and put it, juxtapose it or attach it to one of the pre-existing walls. Not only can you do that, but if you don't want to use a board, you could also make a tzuras haPesach. And I will say, how thick do the side beams of that tzuras haPesach have to be? Any amount. So what Rava, in the second version, what Rava is saying is, it's an either or. For the third wall, you could use a board of a tefach, or you can use the tzuras haPesach. And if you use the tzuras haPesach, there is no minimum shear for the side posts. A third version. So Yigidamri Amarava Utsricha Nami Tzuras haPesach. Rabbi say the third version is that according to Rava, this is very interesting. According to Rava, ultimately again, you need all of the above. What's all of the above? Look at Rashi for just a moment. Mashma de tarvayu ba'inan. Tafach eitza hayotze Vikana bizavis shekinegdo. Vikana shal gabeim kai b'tefach shal. I'm sorry. Let me read that once more. Masha the Tavayo Bayinon. Tefach eitz la yotze. Vikana bizavis shekinegdo. Vikana shal gabeim kai mitefach zel vikana shal zavis. So I'll say ultimately again, according to this third version, whenever you use a tefach board for the third wall, you also need a tzuras haPesach. Shabbos say, so according to this approach, it's picture number 40. Picture number 40. So we'll say, see, interesting enough, three versions of Rava. Now Rava is adopting the same basic premise, which is the minimum share of a sukkah is two walls, and the third wall only has to be a tefach. Rava comes along and says three versions. Version number one is that the way to utilize that third wall, that third tefach wall, is in the form of a tzuras haPesach. And how do you do it? You take the tefach board, you split it into two, and you go out and you take the post on top, tzuras haPesach. Version number two of Rava is that you could use either a tzuras haPesach or the one tefach board. And version number three of Rava is that what? You need both the board and the tzuras haPesach. And I will say, interestingly enough, if you take a look at picture number 40, you can see an illustration of Rava over here, that the illustration actually, according to this third version, is Rava really requires you to do everything, which is what? Take the tefach board, put it within 3 tefachim of the pre-existing wall, so you get your loved wall, and then what? And then make the tzuras haPesach along the rest of the wall. So what Rava will say is the halacha l'Moshe Misinai says the third wall need not be a complete wall. But l'maisa, to maximize that third wall, you really should imply all of the aforementioned strategies. So take a board that's a tefach, place it within 3 tefachim of the pre-existing wall that gives you already a space, that gives you a wall of 4 tefachim, and then make a tzuras haPesach for the rest of the wall, effectively giving you 3 complete halachic walls. Interesting. So the Gemara says as follows: Rav Ashi, Ashkechel Rav Kahana, the Ka'avit Tefach Shochek, the Ka'avit Tzuras haPesach. So we'll see Rav Ashi once saw Rav Kahana putting up his sukkah, and what he was doing is for the third wall, he was using a board that was a Tefach Shochek, right? Remember again, that was a little bit of a looser Tefach. The Ka'avit Tzuras haPesach, and he was also putting up a Tzuras haPesach on the third wall. Amar lei lo savar mar lahad de Rava da Amar Rava v'ni teres nami b'tzuras haPesach. So ultimately, again, Rav Ashi said to Rav Kahana, didn't you hear Rava Shita that Rava said either you could use the tzuras haPesach or the board, but you don't need both? Amar lei ana ki idach lishna de Rava desvirle de Amar Rava utzricha nami tzuras haPesach. To which Rav Kahana responded, I hold like the third version of Rava. And what was the third version of Rava? That it's not an either or, but what? Both. Both. That Rava really felt that for that third wall, you really should be going ahead and using the board and also creating a tzuras haPesach. Fascinating. So we'll say the Gemara goes weiter. Shtaim kil chasam. So we'll say now we get into a very interesting sugya here. So remember again, we paskin that halacha l'maisa, the sukkah has to have we'll call 2 regular walls, and a third wall that is only a tefach. So again, now we've seen the machlokes about how to maximize that third wall, but that's the basic halacha. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava, v'chein l'Shabbos. So this is very interesting. What the Gemara now is going to get into a discussion is as follows. Remember, the goal of a sukkah is to create an enclosure, right? That's what I'm doing over here. I'm trying to create an enclosed area. Now, as I remember again, there's another time in halacha that an enclosure is halachically significant, which is where? Shabbos. Shabbos, you're permitted to go ahead and carry, for example, in an enclosed area. What we're going to try to figure out now, we'll say, is if something is considered enclosed for Sukkah, is it also considered to be enclosed for Shabbos? Which is really quite fascinating. Says the Gemara, so Amar Rava, v'chein l'Shabbos. The same way that 2 walls and a little bit work for Sukkah, 2 walls and a little bit work to create an enclosed area for Shabbos as well. Rashi, look at Rashi, we'll say first wide line, v'chein l'Shabbos, afal pi shetzarach l'Shabbos shalosh mechitzos la'asos rishus hayachid, even though normally for Shabbos you require 3 partitions in order to create the rishus hayachid. Shabbos shal sukkis mutar lismoch al mechitzas hasukkah. Im aser b'rishos harabim samach lepischo, sukkah de'in ba'el shtayim kilchas v'shlish savil tefach, machnis umotzi hemenu labayis, va'af agav de b'shar shabasos lo mishteri. Inam b'shar mechitz she'en shasukkah lo mishteri. Listen to this. So this is fascinating. So let's say you made your sukkah in Rosh Hashanah, right? Let's say again your home opens up into Rosh Hashanah. You made your sukkah in Rosh Hashanah right outside of your home. Okay. So then I will say so the shaila is, and the sukkah is made of 2 walls and a tefach. So the Gemara says like this: is such a sukkah kosher? And the answer is yes. So if it's considered to be enclosed for Sukkah, it's considered to be enclosed for Shabbos. Even though I will say normally, again, al tilcho Shabbos, if you have an area that's enclosed by 2 walls and a tefach, is that area considered to be enclosed? The answer is no. But listen to this. On Shabbos of Sukkot, the same way that Sukkah works as an enclosure for Sukkah, it'll work as an enclosure for Shabbos of Sukkot as well. But only for the Shabbos of Sukkot. Right, but the Shabbos after Sukkot, the Shabbos before Sukkot, that is considered to be what? An unenclosed area. And the logic is, if it's an enclosure for Sukkah, it's an enclosure for Shabbos as well. Someone ravachin the Shabbos, migo da have yodofen linyan Sukkah, have yodofen linyan Shabbos. If it's a wall for Sukkah, it's a wall for Shabbos. So we'll say, so again, I want to point out, but it's only a wall for which Shabbos? For which Shabbos? Shabbos of Sukkot. Right? It's fascinating. The Shabbos before, the Shabbos after, this is considered to be an open, breached area, and one would not be permitted to carry within. So the Gemara goes weiter. Abaye is the kasha. Migo. Do we actually say migo? In other words, do we say that if something is an enclosure for Sukkah, it automatically is an enclosure for Shabbos? Vatanya, we learned, dofen Sukkah kidofen Shabbos. Whatever constitutes a wall for Sukkah constitutes a wall for Shabbos. Ubevad shelo yehe bein kana lechavero shlosha tfachim. As long as what? There's never more than between one board and its fellow 3 tfachim. In other words, as long as there's lavud. As long as there's lavud, ultimately again it'll work. V'yisir Shabbos al Sukkah, but Shabbos is even more machmer than Sukkah. Why? Shabbos eino niteres ela ba'omid baruba ala paratz. Because we'll say, listen to this. In order to constitute a mechitza, a wall for Shabbos purposes, the wall must have, we'll call it more closed than open areas. And as Rabbi say, we've discussed that you could create a wall, a halachic wall, even with the majority of the space being open space. You could do such a thing like this. For Shabbos, a mechitza must be what's called omed meruba ala paretz. The closed area must be more than the open area. Masha'en came to Sukkah. But at the end of the day, that's not true for Sukkah. We'll say for Sukkah, you could have a halachic wall that actually has more open spaces than closed spaces. So you see from here that what? My love Yisera Shabbos the Sukkah, as Sukkah. But it sounds like over here that what? That you could have a Sukkah that is good for Sukkah's purposes, but for Shabbos of Sukkah's, the area won't be considered enclosed. To which the Gemara says, no. My love, you say the Shabbos Sukkah, migo. To which the Gemara says, maybe we don't say that just because something is an enclosure for Sukkos, it's automatically an enclosure for Sukkos, for Shabbos Sukkos as well. Lo, you say Shabbos da'alma al Shabbos Sukkah. No. What it means is like this. We both say that you could have something that on a regular Shabbos will not constitute an enclosure, but for Shabbos of Sukkot, it will be considered an enclosure. Why? Because if it works for Sukkah, it'll work for the Shabbos of Sukkot as well. Ihachi, if that's the case, listening nami yiseiru Sukkah da'alma Sukkah de Shabbos, you should go ahead and say that sometimes again, regular Sukkah has a chumrah of Sukkah and Shabbos, the Sukkah da'alma by a tefach shochek. Because in regular Sukkah, the third wall requires an amma, or actually requires a tefach that is a loose tefach. Ve'ilo besukkah de Shabbos lo baya tefach shochek. Rabbi said, say for Hilchos Shabbos, right? You do not need the use of a loose tefach. V'sagi belechi. And remember again, if you're using a lechi, for example, daha'atu da'amrit sichech hagabe mavui sheyesh lechi kosher. Because, for example, again, you said before that if you go ahead and you throw schach over a mavui, and the mavui has a lechi, that lechi, Rabosai, constitutes the third wall. Even though, again, that lechi might measure just a mashu, just something. So we'll say, here you see something very interesting. Now we'll say, what's the logic of that? It's the reverse logic. What's the reverse logic? Essentially, we'll say, if you have a mavui, and you put a lechi, right? We'll say lechi is a side beam. You put a lechi by the entrance of that mavui. How big does that lechi have to be? Any amount. As long as it's recognizable, any amount. And what does that lechi do? What does that lechi do? That lechi creates an enclosure. So listen to what the Gemara says. If you have a mavui, which essentially means you have two perpendicular walls, and you have, parallel walls, thank you. You have two parallel walls, and you place a lechi at the entranceway of that mavui, and you throw schach on top of that mavui. Is that sukkah kosher? Yes. Why? Because if it's considered to be enclosed for Shabbos, it's considered to be enclosed for sukkah. It's the reverse. We see up until now, we were saying that if something is considered to be enclosed for Shabbos, the paradigmatic example of this is like this. If you have a sukkah that's two full walls, and a third wall of a tefach, that is considered to be enclosed for sukkahs. So we're saying if it's considered to be enclosed for sukkahs, it's considered to be enclosed for Shabbos. Which Shabbos? Okay. Shabbos of sukkahs. Right? But again, the Shabbos before, the Shabbos after, that is not an enclosed area. So Shneck says, okay, but why don't you say the reverse as well? If you have a mavui that's permitted with a lechi, and you throw some schach on top of that, suddenly again you have a kosher sukkah, even though your third wall is less than what? Less than a tefach. Why? Because if it's closed for Shabbos, it's enclosed for sukkah. To which the Gemara says, Hahulo itzrichale. You don't even have to say that. I'll tell you why. Hashta mikilta lechamirta aminon mechamirta lekilta kol shekin. I will say, goes without saying that if something works for Shabbos, of course it'll work for Sukkah. As I will say, remember again, out of the two, Sukkah is considered to be the kal, and ultimately again, Shabbos is the chamer. So once you establish that migo, whatever works for Sukkah, will work for Shabbos, then what? It goes without saying that whatever works for Shabbos works for Sukkah. So we'll say a really fascinating idea that being espoused by Rava, that essentially, even though when you kind of line them up side by side, the halachos of enclosure for Sukkah are different than the halachos of enclosure for Shabbos, but the one time when these two worlds will collide and essentially mesh with each other is the Shabbos of the Yom Tov of Sukkot. Because it is then what we will say is whatever is effectively an enclosure for Sukkah purposes will work as an enclosure for Shabbos purposes as well. The reverse is true as well. Whatever will work as an enclosure for Shabbos purposes will ultimately work as an enclosure for Sukkah purposes. But the Gemara says that's obvious. That's obvious because Shabbos is more chamer than Sukkah. Incredible. Gufa, Amar Rava. Rava said, Amad Beis, Sichech agabe mavuin, sheyesh lo lechi, kshera. What we said before. If you go ahead and you put schach on top of a mavui that has a lechi. Right? Schach on top of a mavui that has a lechi. So we'll say, so again, alright, the truth is we're skipping a lot of pictures, but fine. So the Gemara says as follows. So if you go ahead and you put schach on top of a mavui that has a lechi. Now, boss, remember again, what's the chiddush in that case? What's the chiddush? The chiddush is how big is the lechi? A mashu, and any amount. So remember again, you have a third wall, but that third wall is not a tefach. Nevertheless, the sukkah is kosher. Because we'll say again, remember the logic being, whatever works for Shabbos will work for sukkah. V'amar Rava said, Sichech al pase biraos kshera. We'll say an interesting case over here. What happens if you put schach on top of pase biraos? Well, remember again, the pasuk, we had this in Eruvin. Take a look at Rashi. You should have an image. You have a picture there in Rashi as well, right? You see again, paratraining the Eruvin. Tznan detiru chacham mishum oli regalim laasos lepase biraos sherishos harabim pasin arba kimo diyumadin. So also remember again, this was the unique kula that we had ultimately again by wells. A well normally satisfies the dimensions of a reshus hayochid. But yet, wells are often situated in a Rishus Harabim, which of course creates a problem for drawing water on Shabbos. So Chazal introduced this halacha, which is, if you create these four sets of posts, right? These four sets of perpendicular posts, each one measuring an amma in each direction, you effectively enclose the well, making the area around the well a reshus hayachid and giving you the ability to draw water. But listen to this case. Says Rava, Sichech al gabe pasibiraos. What happens if you throw schach? Place schach on top of these pasiras, on top of these right angle enclosures, these right angle mechitzos. So what's the halacha? Ksheira, it's kosher. Nebo says same logic. Why is that sukkah kosher? Why is the sukkah kosher? What? Because remember again, this is an incredible anomaly. Because remember again, you look at this picture, and this does not satisfy the criteria. Because the truth is, remember, it could satisfy the criteria of sukkah of what? If what? Right? If you want to say that it was lavud. But if it was lavud, then Abba said that wouldn't be the din of pasibiros. Because if it's lavud, then what? Everyone would agree that this area is enclosed. Obviously, this is not lavud. So the incredible chiddush over here is that this enclosure does not work al hilchos sukkah, but because it works al hilchos Shabbos, migo it works for Shabbos, it'll work for sukkah as well. So I'll say, so therefore, essentially, what you have over here is Rava basically stating this halacha 3 different times. So the Gemara says as follows: and I need all 3 cases of Rava. Why do I need all 3 cases of Rava? Because if Rava would have just said the din by mavoi, that the same way that a mavoi with a little lechi, right, a little lechi is considered to be enclosed for Shabbos, it's considered to be enclosed for Sukkos. If Rava would have just said it by there, I would have said, you know why mavoi works? The ika shtei defanos ma'al yasa. Rabbi said the case of mavoi works. You know why? Because at least in mavoi, what do you have? 2 functional walls. The Gemara says, "Aval gabi pasi biros." The lekrishtei defanos ma'al. But in the case of pasi biros, Rabbi said the well enclosure, you don't even have really one functional wall. You don't have any functional walls. So I would have thought that just because that works out an enclosure for Shabbos doesn't make it a kosher sukkah. Therefore, Rava has to say no. Even by pasi biros, if you put some schach on top of that, that'll work. V'yashmoinon pasi biros. And if you would have just told me the case of pasi biros, mishum diika shem arba defanos. Because Rabbi say again, in the case of pasibiros, at least what do you have by pasibiros? What's the mila pasibiros? You have 4 walls, quote unquote, 4 walls, and that's why maybe since it works for Shabbos, it works for Sukkah. But by the case of mavui, all you have are 2 walls, and what? They're perpendicular to each other. So maybe again that doesn't work at all. And furthermore, I will say I would have said the 2 cases of mavui and pasibiros work because those are Shabbos cases. So what you're establishing is whatever works for Shabbos works for Sukkah, which makes sense. Why? Because Shabbos is more chamer, so it makes sense. Whatever works for the more chamer works for the cow. But I will say maybe the reverse would not be true. In other words, maybe we don't say that just because something is an enclosure for Sukkah, it becomes an enclosure for Shabbos as well. Therefore, tzricha. Therefore, I will say Rava teaches us that the relationship works both ways. So I will say, so according to Rava, and there are elements of this Tadar Halacha Lamaisa. We're not going to get into this now, but Rava creates a principle, and the principle is whatever is considered to be an enclosure for Shabbos is considered to be an enclosure for Sukkah, and the reverse is also true. Whatever is considered to be an enclosure for Sukkah will be an enclosure for Shabbos. But will be an enclosure for which Shabbos? Which Shabbos? The Shabbos of Sukkot. This is incredibly important on both sides. So which gives you, according to Rava, you could have an area that is considered to be enclosed, the Shabbos of Sukkot, but the Shabbos after Sukkot and the Shabbos before Sukkot is considered to be unenclosed. Because the logic of Rava is migo. Since it's going to work for Sukkah, it's going to work for Shabbos as well. But Shabbos before, Shabbos after, won't be. So remember again, the next thing the Mishnah said is that a Sukkah, the schach, is not kosher if it allows more sunlight than shade. In other words, a schach must provide more shade than sunlight. And therefore, again, if the schach allows in chamasa miruba mitzilasa, more shade than sunlight, the schach is possible. Tana Rabbanan, chamasa machmas sichoch v'lo machmas stefanos. So say Tanakama says, when we look at shade of Osai, we only care about the shade versus sunlight ratio from the schach. What don't we care about? The walls. So for example, Tanakama says, Rabbanan say, if your walls allow in more sun than shade, we don't care about that. We only care about the sun-shade ratio from the top. Rabbi Yoshia Omer, Af Machmas Stefanos. Rabbi Yoshia says, no. We even look at the sun-shade ratio from the walls. And if the walls allow in more sun than shade, that'll be an invalidation in the sukkah. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yemar Bar Shalmia Mishmei Dabaye. My time with Rabbi Yoshia. What's Rabbi Yoshia's logic? T'chsiv v'sakosa al ha'aron es ha'parochas. The pasuk says, you shall go ahead. Now the paroches is the curtain which divides between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which literally means you shall place upon the aron the curtain. Paroches mechitza. Now the paroches, the curtain itself is a mechitza. The paroches is a wall. V'kakarye rachmana sichacha. Both say this is fascinating. So Rabbi Yoshia makes an amazing observation. Rabbi Yoshia says the curtain is a wall, but yet how does the Torah refer to the curtain? How does it refer to it? As schach, which tells you what? Alma mechitza kischach ba'inan. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That a wall must conform to the same details as schach. Namely what? Just as the schach must provide more shade than sun, so too the wall must provide more shade than sun as well. Rabbi Yoshia's model is if the wall allows in more sun than shade, that is an invalid wall. For Rabbanan, what do the Rabbanan do with that? For Rabbanan, hahu denekav beiporta the mechzik is. It's very interesting. The Rabbanan say that the construction in the mikdash was the following. The Rabbanan say the curtain did not hang straight down, but rather the curtain actually was hung a little bit at a vertical slant. Again, we'll discuss it. It's a little bit at a vertical slant. How exactly the curtain laid like that, we'll see. Well, the truth is we know. How did the curtain lay at a vertical slant? What was sticking into the curtain? The poles of the aron. We saw this in Yuma. So remember again, the curtain essentially was at a slant like schach. So it didn't look just like a wall. It looked a little bit like a roof as well. So, but not to teach you that the dinim of schach apply to the wall, but to teach you how to hang the curtain. Incredible. Amr Abaye, Rabbi, Rabbi Yoshia, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel, Ubei Shammai, Rabbi Eliezer B'Achirim, Kulu Svirlahu. We'll say all of these opinions just quoted all hold to the same thing. Kulu Svirlahu, Sukkah Diras Keva Ba'ina. We'll say this is incredible. All of them agree that Allah Lamaisa, the walls of a sukkah, or I should say, the sukkah must be set up as a diras keva, as a permanent dwelling. Now we'll say what that means. The whole issue of sukkah is as diras harai. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Meretz Hashem with this conversation of sukkah, the requirement of diras keva by sukkah tomorrow. Go ahead, we'll say.
It's not kosher the day before. Just the Shabbos.
Just that.
Not the Shabbos part, the day before. Like Friday and Sunday.
Well, no. Because you're dealing with a sukkah that's kosher. The sukkah itself is fine. It's just that the way you've made the sukkah does not conform with the normative halachos of Shabbos. So the sukkah is fine all 8 days. And the chiddush is that even on Shabbos it's going to be okay. But just this Shabbos, the same structure, if you leave it up for next Shabbos, is going to be not good for Shabbos. Correct.
So even with the well, there's no model. That's still
Oh, right. Okay. That'll be a kosher sukkah on Shabbos. Right. But not all the time.
But after the day before,
Correct.
It's possible. That's right. Like it's like a model. It's all right because
It works both ways.
Correct.
Correct. That's the essence of Shabbos. Manifestations of how often we are done. And in so strives all of this is a God I see. That's how they can use it. Shabbos should be in Sarah's. Depends on whether you're eating.